Now, what I'm going to do for the first 20 minutes or so, I think, is I'm just going to talk about something which seems to be recurring. I'm going to kind of interrupt my current broadcast, if you like, to talk about something which seems to be increasingly recurring in the questions I'm getting here, which is effectively, this is fine, I believe you, it makes sense, but how do I tell my boss? How do I tell my finance director? How do I tell anybody who I need money? Okay, how do I explain this to them? Because we've increasingly, I think, entered a world where speculative expenditure is frowned on. Everything demands sort of perfect proof, and anything which is what you might call hypothetical or speculative effectively is the first thing that falls to the budgetary axe. And I think we need to know how to tackle it, because to be absolutely honest, the biggest challenge of marketing isn't making marketing work. Marketing tends to work simply because, at a very crude level, before we get into the detail of targeting, before we get into the detail of even the specific message, simply being famous is better than not. The more people who've heard of you, even if they don't know very much about you, and even if they don't seem absolutely perfectly honed to the core target audience, even so, that will increase effectively your opportunities. Everybody who's heard of you, even if they just know your name, recognize your logo, is an increased propensity to buy. So even at the most vaguest level, even at the crudest level, marketing tends to work. It doesn't always work immediately, and it doesn't always work measurably. And that's the problem, because a lot of marketing works in a way that's so removed from the initial stimulus that it would be impossible to measure it. Jeremy Bulmer always refers to a story where somebody said, I've just bought an Aston Martin, Jeremy, they said. And they said, what won't surprise you to hear is that I bought the Aston Martin as a result of an advertisement I saw. Okay. What might surprise you is that I saw that advertisement when I was 11 years old. And so a large amount of marketing simply works through accretion, repetition, a gradual process of familiarity. And those things are, by definition, impossible to measure, because there is no one individual stimulus that necessarily leads to the sale, nor should we assume that there is. That only happens when you're very close to the point of purchase. The idea that there's one thing that tips you over the edge between buy and don't buy. Most marketing actually works as a process of accumulative messaging, okay? And as a result, anything that's accumulative automatically doesn't become perfectly attributable or measurable or quantifiable. And this is, I think, where we have the biggest problem. Now, I'll go back to the beginning here to an extent, which is, as I mentioned in some of my earlier talks, the nature of the kind of businesses who do marketing is different now. In other words, the kind of employer you'll end up working marketing job in 1989 or 1992. Okay, it's just different. So in my earliest years in advertising, one of the reasons why the advertising agency was so dominant compared to, say, the direct marketing agency or the PR agency or there wasn't a digital agency back then, okay, was simply that 2/3 of marketing expenditure, ad spend, to be precise, was basically packaged consumer goods. It was Rowntree Macintosh, it was Cadbury, it was Unilever, it was P&G, it was Reckitt Benckiser. Now, those are all organizations which had marketing at their core, where the chief executive had done a 5-year stint in the marketing department, where there were marketers on the board, and where there was a general understanding that marketing, even though it wasn't necessarily perfectly quantifiable as an investment, as an expenditure, it had an important role to play. Now that's completely changed. So now I think that figure, which was more than 2/3, is now under 25%. What that actually means, I mean, extraordinarily, what that means is that if you go into a random marketing job, the odds are it won't be in one of those companies I just mentioned, some of which no longer conventionally exist anymore. It might be for financial services, broadband providers, mobile telephone networks, mobile telephone handset makers, finance, B2B. All of those areas which are less marketing centric and where marketing has typically enjoyed a lower status within the organization have become much, much more prominent and much, much more active in terms of their marketing. But the actual status of marketing within those organizations has yet to reach the same heights as it might have had within a Cadbury or within a brewer or within a P&G or a Reckitt Benckiser or a Dove or a Persil and so on. Okay. And in particular, what you see is in B2B, in tech, for example, in quite a lot of areas, we worked in the very early days with a telephone company marketing. This was BT. And in 1988 to 1990, the very idea of someone advertising the use of the telephone genuinely seemed like a strange thing to do. We didn't think there was a role for marketing. I mean, consumers didn't. They said, if I need to make a phone call, I pick up the phone, okay? And if I don't, I don't. The idea that advertising might have a role in, for example, something like, consumer telephony was deeply unfamiliar then. It took a great effort within BT, British Telecom, to actually get a marketing and advertising budget put together in the first place. And what you find typically in those technological, to use a slightly generalized term, left brain cultures, is there's generally a hostility to the idea of marketing. Because engineering, for example, finance, is all about worlds where there's a number for the things that matter, okay? That's the thing you've got to understand. In engineering, if you want to build a bridge, everything that matters can be captured numerically. Whether it's tensile strength, whether it's whatever the other one, there's an opposite of that. There is a number, there is a measure, there is a formula that basically defines success. I'm so sorry, this is so annoying. Hello. Drop it inside, thank you very much indeed. Thanks. And what you're asking these people to do is suddenly enter a world. It's to quote, to quote the Big Lebowski, to them, this is a world of pain because it's a world where there aren't numbers to capture the necessary things necessarily, and where there isn't a single right answer, and you can't really prove in advance that something will work. I hate to say it, but everything you do to some extent has a level of speculation in it. Because yes, you can test, and yes, you can improve things significantly by testing. But bluntly put, because something worked 2 years ago is not necessarily evidence that it'll work now. And so, moods change. I give the example actually recently that when the pandemic hit, every airline in the world had to turn off its pricing algorithms. The pricing algorithms had learned how to price flights over 5, 10, 15 long years of experience in a world where if you drop the price of a flight, more people wanted to get on the plane. Suddenly they're in a world where maybe 2% of the world's population would pay anything to get on a plane, or 1% of the world's population, and the other 98% wouldn't get on a plane if you put a gun to your head. So dropping the price of flights to try and create demand, which had been a truth in the previous 20 years, was suddenly a massive falsehood. Now, people who are, let's face it, they've probably studied something like engineering at university. Then they've worked as an accountant. They've worked in a world which is effectively a subset of reality where things that matter happen to be quantifiable. And when a marketing person goes in, the problem you face is suddenly you're dealing with language which, first of all, they often don't understand, which sounds unbelievably vague and fluffy, and where there isn't what you might call a concrete connection between activity and return. Now, I think what tends to happen here is one of two things happen, and neither of them's good. Either they effectively dismiss marketing largely as something too fluffy and unpredictable and uncertain to spend money on. Or when they do spend money, they spend it disproportionately on those things which are quantifiable, which causes them to spend too much at the bottom of the funnel, where there's a fairly close relationship between cause and effect. Put ad on Facebook, get click through, maybe even measure sale. Okay, they spend all their money on that, whereas brand building and the other equally important, and by the way, they're complementary. I'm not for a second suggesting that you shouldn't do the bottom of the funnel stuff, nor that you shouldn't optimize it. I'm merely saying that on its own, it isn't enough. I'm also going to add something, which is to say that on its own, it might be very, very dangerous. Because if all you know what to do is to get people who you have predefined on past experience, if all you know how to do as a business is to exploit the past, if all you know is the what and you don't know the why of your business, then I think you become at significant risk. And I'm going to tell a story about this, which I think is quite important. Now, I'm giving a talk fairly shortly, which is entitled, "I'm sorry, but we really should have warned you about this." And the reason I'm talking about this is for a good 6 years before there was even a World Wide Web, I worked in direct marketing. And as I said before, direct marketing is measurable, it's quantifiable. You can test, you can measure, you can experiment. You can actually work out an ROI on a piece of activity, just a short-term ROI. It's not sufficient to assume that the ROI will always remain the same, or that the ROI is independent of what you spend on brand advertising, by the way. But nonetheless, you can do A/B tests and confidently say that at an average level right now, saying this is better than saying that. And by the way, that's great. It's fantastic that you can test, not necessarily because you can optimize your conversion rate, but what's fantastic about testing is that you learn, okay? And to some extent, I think you need testing, and then you need behavioral science. When testing provides the what, behavioral science can at least speculate intelligently about the why. Why did that message work better? Why did a message, to take the example of KFC in Australia, where maximum 4 per customer was the most motivating message to get people to buy chips for $1, okay? In that case, what's really, really interesting is that I think with behavioral science, you can say, if you don't have behavioral science, you just go, it's weird, isn't it? We tested this and it just seemed to work. With behavioral science, you do say, okay, offers tend to have a higher perceived value if there is the impression of scarcity. And the value of something isn't, the emotional perception of value isn't just driven by what something is or what it costs. It's driven by other factors. This is why, only 3 left at this price is an extraordinarily potent thing in terms of online retail or in terms of online airline seat selling. Okay, we've all done it. Okay, we've gone online and it says, oh yes, I'm interested in flights to Bali or flights to Paris or whatever, and it says only 4 left at this price, and immediately your impetus to act is inordinately accelerated. The thing takes on a completely new value when you know that it's in short supply. Similarly, sale 2 weeks only. I've noticed online some retailers are starting to do 24-hour sales, or even briefer than that. It's 20% off between 7 and midnight. They will actually do now online a 5-hour sale. And they've made this same discovery that bizarrely, in many ways, the briefer the sale is, the more appeal it holds. And if you're in that business, definitely test that kind of thing. It has an additional advantage, by the way, having a brief sale, which is that it drives incremental demand from people who weren't thinking of buying. And it minimizes, because the sale is brief, the number of people who actually pay less than they were willing to pay anyway, because they happen to stumble into your website when there's a sale on. Okay? Some of those people who buy in a 5-day sale or a 10-day sale probably would have paid full price for the thing they were looking for. They found it in a sale, and you ended up effectively leaving money on the table. One very, very clever example of this kind of price discrimination, by the way, is the McDonald's wrap of the day, which is one of the ideas that really appeals to me. So there are, I think, and someone might correct me on this, there are 4 different flavors of McDonald's wrap. There's a sweet chili one. I think there might be one with bacon, if I got that right. There might be, I think there's a spicy vegetable wrap. But there are 4 flavors of McDonald's wrap. And on any given day, one of the 4 flavors is sold at £1 off. Now, what's clever about that is someone who's price sensitive sacrifices their ideal choice of flavor to save £1, and someone who isn't price sensitive pays full price to get the flavor they want. There's probably an additional benefit, by the way, if you're McDonald's, because if you have a wrap of the day, you can confidently say you're probably going to sell more of that wrap proportionately than you are of the other 3 wraps. So it might be safe to actually produce some of those wraps in advance, which makes the whole process more efficient. But that's a very clever idea, which is how do you discount to people who care about savings while not discounting to people who don't? And actually having a very brief sale strikes me as a really, really intelligent and interesting thing. Another thing that would increase the value of a sale is an exclusive pre-sale visit to existing customers. Because another thing that adds to the perceived value of a discount is the feeling that you're getting savings that aren't available to the public at large. Tesco in the UK has done a very clever thing where it effectively has cheaper prices for club card holders. Now, most people in the UK actually are Tesco club card holders. What Sainsbury's is doing the same thing. Effectively, if you have the Sainsbury's card, the Nectar card, again, you get special discounts. The great thing about that is that even though most people probably qualify, the majority of people, when you feel that you are qualifying for preferential treatment rather than getting a discount that's universally available to everybody, okay, the perceived value of the saving is just higher. And those things, I think, those things are really, really interesting. By the way, I've mentioned my colleague Paulo Mercado before in the Philippines. He worked for 11 years for Nestle, and he's convinced that there's a whole missing science around how we do promotion effectively, how we actually understand these things. There's a finding from behavioral science that generally 50% extra free on, say, a packet of oven chips or a bottle of shampoo, 50% extra free has a higher perceived value than 33% off the price, even though economically the price you're paying per unit is exactly the same. Why is that a really important finding? Well, it's important anyway, because it's more popular. But the reason it's doubly important, when you think about it, is that the margin erosion on giving people more of what you're selling, particularly on a high margin product, is much, much less than the margin erosion of giving 50% off. Okay, let's assume we have a really high margin product. Let's take premium tights, for example, okay, where I imagine you sell them for £12 and they probably cost you £1 to manufacture. Well, 50% off means you're actually losing £6 in potential revenue, okay? Buy one, get one free means the cost of the additional pair of tights is actually only £1. And yet the perceived value of that is arguably higher than dropping the price by 50%. And the other thing you're not doing, arguably, is you're not reframing their expectation of how much to pay nearly as much as you would be doing if you actually drop the price. You know, a large part of sales promotion, if we're not careful, is effectively training the populace to go discount hunting. If you want a really exciting finding about this, about perceived value, I have always wanted to do a test where you actually put 50% extra free on a packet of oven chips, say, or a bar of chocolate or a bottle of shampoo. And you put the price up by 50% to see what happens. Now, obviously, it's illegal, okay? I'm not going to do that. I'm not proposing you do it. I just wanted to know what happened if you put 50% extra free on and you put the price up by 50%, because there you're increasing the perceived value someone's getting, but you're not increasing the actual value. And obviously, I'm not proposing any reputable brand or any person should do this because it's illegal and it's completely unethical. Okay. But I always wanted to know what would happen. And it turned out we do know what would happen because every now and then a company does it by mistake. They have the packaging, which says 50% extra free, and they forget to actually recalibrate the price down at the till. What's interesting is the effect on sales is basically just as great as if you do drop the price by 33%. Okay, sorry, if you keep the price stable. Yeah, in other words, if you keep the price stable and put 50% extra free, or if you put the price up by 50% and put 50% extra free, there's a difference. There's a difference. It's not very big. Now, okay, you could say that's just because people don't know what things are worth. But what it suggests is that economics is to some extent wrong because people are either buying a deal or, and this is equally important, they might be using a deal just to decide between competing alternatives. I can't decide between these 5 bottles of shampoo, but there's a deal on with this one, so that's the one I'll buy. In other words, if the shampoo is already within your repertoire, you just buy the one that happens to have a deal attached. Okay, there are some categories, by the way, like pizza delivery, where you can't sell without a deal. Someone tried the experiment basically where they just had everyday low pricing for pizza delivery and consumers basically hated it. They really didn't want to know. They didn't want a £5 pizza. They wanted a £10 pizza that was 50% off. But this is really important, I think, because the engineering or the rational financial mindset assumes that a pound is a pound is a pound, and what you get and what you pay for it are the only 2 things in the equation that are actually worth looking at. Volume of good, price of good, simple, straightforward equation. Now, we know from what I was saying last time that that really isn't true. You know, how you present information, even with that example of the speedometer, where you give people minutes per 10 miles rather than miles per hour, even presenting exactly the same fact in a different format will fundamentally change the way people react to it. And once you accept that, you have to accept marketing. But the problem I think you face is that most of these people you'll be dealing with who aren't in the marketing department, and you're in a B2B company, a tech company, a finance company, an engineering focused company, any of those businesses will have a predominantly kind of reductionist mindset. And I would also argue you'll probably find it's predominantly male as well, particularly at the top. And those 2 things in combination probably make it even worse still. Okay, the maleness combined with the reductionist mindset means that people are less and less willing to consider alternative explanations for the world. They have their very, very neat view of how the world works, and they don't want anybody coming along and disrupting it. And this is one of the reasons why I think that behavioral economics might be important to marketing, because it is effectively a Trojan horse to allow you to have marketing conversations in the vocabulary and language of economics. So as I said in my last talk, I think whatever you do read books about economics. Read the Stephen Landesman book, The Armchair Economist. Read the Tim Harford books, The Logic of Life, because having that vocabulary and understanding the mindset, it's a bit like knowing your enemy. Understanding the mindset is really, really important. Okay. The point here I'm going to make is that if you don't know how your enemy is thinking, you can't actually win them over at all. You can't win the argument. And so I think there's something really, really important here we need to understand much better, which is that most marketers haven't studied economics. And so they don't really understand the mindset of where that person's coming from. Most marketers are just familiar. They're resigned to the fact that we live in a world where not everything makes sense, where you don't entirely know what will work in advance, where there isn't a single right answer, there are multiple alternative answers, where the opposite of a good idea isn't wrong, it can be another good idea, for example. And understanding all these things, I think is really, really fascinating, okay? Because we don't understand why it is that everybody else finds marketing so discomforted, because we're used to a world in which you can't say the correct answer is 7.39 most of the time. Now, this gets me back to my point about my early days in direct marketing, which is I love working in direct marketing. I still do. I consider myself a direct marketer. I consider the fact that you can test and measure and hence learn absolutely invaluable. But there's a big, big problem to working in direct marketing, which is once you offer a client, or to some extent, even someone in an agency, the opportunity to do things which are measurable, they lose the will to do anything else. And I think that's dangerous. As I said before, I think, you can suggest something completely sensible. These people are very valuable customers. Shall we send them a Christmas card? Shall we send them a birthday card? Shall we send them a thank you, for example? Is there a way we can add value that they would find really, really nice? Is there useful information we can give them? I mean, this is one of the strangest things, okay? One of the things I noticed that's disappeared from advertising to some extent is just useful information. I'll give you two examples, okay? I was talking to someone at a very large mobile phone network, and I couldn't understand why they hadn't told anybody about Wi-Fi calling. And they said, yeah, but all our competitors offer it, okay? It's not a distinguishing feature. Wi-Fi calling, if you don't know what it is, if you use your phone for voice calls still, which probably means you're over 30, but if you do occasionally make or receive voice calls or texts, if you turn on Wi-Fi calling on your phone, on your handset, it means that you can still receive and make calls over your mobile network if you've got a Wi-Fi connection, even if you haven't got a connection to a 2, 3, 4 or 5G mast. So you can be in a basement, you can be in an underground nightclub, a dungeon, a prison, you can be in a cottage in the middle of nowhere. And even if there's no mobile signal, if you can log on to somebody's Wi-Fi, you can still make and receive a call. Okay? Unbelievably useful, because suddenly the value of the network to the consumer goes up by a factor of 5, because all those annoying not spots you used to experience where you go effing O2 or effing Orange or effing Vodafone, 90% of those disappear. And yet not one penny was spent telling people about this. Genuinely. It became a function on iPhones. The mobile networks knew who had an iPhone. It then became a function on Android phones. Nobody spent a penny telling everybody about it. In the UK, you may not know this, if you go to the Royal Mail website, for 60p, you can pay for your postman to collect parcels from you. You just pay for the postage, pay an extra 60p, choose a date from tomorrow onwards, and rather than having to go to the post office for a special delivery postage thing, or to send a parcel or a package, or to return something to Amazon, or to return something to ASOS, or whoever it may be, no, you just pay 60p. You leave the package in the porch, or you wait for the postman to ring, and he collects it. Not a penny of advertising has been spent telling anybody about this. Now, I would argue in that case, you almost have a responsibility to tell the public about this, because for elderly people or the disabled and so forth, or people who are constrained, it's a bit of a game changer. It's a really important service. For a lot of people, it's a really, really big deal. Suddenly, more people may buy through e-commerce this way. But no, it's kept completely secret. You have to discover it for yourself by visiting the website. Now, as it happens, many people do visit that website, but a hell of a lot of people have had no reason to visit the website. They still don't know. And I think something started happening, which is I always noticed this in direct marketing, even back before there was digital marketing, which basically means the first 10 or 11 years of my working life, which is once people could do things where they could measure the effect, they lost the will to do things where you couldn't measure. They lost the kind of mental ability. And my brutal truth is to say that most of marketing, most necessary things you do in marketing will never have direct singular causality. Okay? All you can say is, they probably have an effect by contributing to 3 other effects, and the combined result of these various activities is a sale. The only area where you get very direct causality is when you're testing very close to the point of purchase. And what I notice is that more and more effort is put into that point of purchase thing. But there's an additional thing which is being discarded. And this is the thing that really worries me. And it worries me one hell of a lot. Okay. Which is that the value of what you test is not purely in what you actually, in making more money by doing the thing that works more than the thing that doesn't work. It's also the value lies in what you learn. Okay. And so you have this extraordinary thing where many businesses were happy simply because they were getting demonstrable improvement in sales results. They were happy to hand over the whole business of defining and selling to their customers to Facebook, for example, and effectively to a black box. Now, that was the apotheosis of this problem I was talking about, which is direct marketing isn't just about what you earn, it's also about what you learn. And in many cases, what you learn, because it can be applied elsewhere, it can be applied elsewhere in your activities, what you learn is more valuable in the long term than what you earn in the short term. But what they were doing is handing over to Facebook the whole question of where their advertisements appeared, even what the advertisement said. So all they knew was that things financially were improving, nothing to see here, move on, nothing to worry about. They didn't know why these things were happening. And they possibly, in many cases, didn't even know, unless they had much better attribution, they didn't even know who was being optimized through this invisible algorithm over which they had no control and for which they had absolutely no visibility. Well, you might say, mightn't you? Well, who cares? I mean, we're making more money this year than we were last year. I get to keep my job. What is there to worry about? Well, I'll tell you what there is to worry about, which is this. iOS 14 comes out. Suddenly, iOS 14 does something, very, very simple behavioral economics trick. It actually asks people, would you like to control your privacy? With a strong expectation and a strong nudge that people are going to say yes. And suddenly, a large proportion of the data that Facebook was using to reach iOS customers, who are disproportionately a large number of people in certain parts of the world, and tend to be disproportionately wealthy and valuable to online retailers and online marketers, suddenly everything Facebook knew, it was like the algorithm for airlines when COVID started. When iOS turned off the sharing of information, effectively everything these algorithms thought they knew about what would happen suddenly became irrelevant. And there are whole businesses now which are in crisis because they became over-dependent on something they couldn't see and couldn't control and couldn't learn from. And this reminds me of something that Drayton Bird said. And it's a very surprising thing. If anybody knows Drayton Bird, he was the great, still is really, the great guru of direct marketing in the UK. He was kind of a British equivalent to those wonderful people like sort of Claude Hopkins and Bill Jamie, who nobody's heard about anymore because nobody studies advertising books. But nonetheless, Claude Hopkins, Bill Jamie, those old classic direct marketing writers are well worth reading still, even though in some cases they were writing in the 1920s and 30s. James Webb Young is another person, more writing in the 40s and 50s. He's also a brilliant person to read. It's called, in slightly sexist vein, How to Become an Advertising Man. But it explains the principles of advertising and to some extent marketing, actually, because the advertising was much less purely a comms business back in that era than it became since. But those books are all worth reading. And Drayton Bird, who was the equivalent of those people in the UK, great friend of David Ogilvy's, by the way, Drayton Bird once came up to me and said, now, there's nothing remotely fluffy about Drayton Bird. He's not self-indulgent. He believes in profit. He believes the purpose of advertising and marketing is to sell. But nonetheless, he said, you don't do direct marketing to earn money. You do it to learn. And the point is that what you learn may be far more widely applicable okay, outside the fields, the narrow fields in direct marketing, where you can actually measure. You might reasonably assume that if this message, if talking about X is particularly potent in a direct marketing message, then maybe our advertising should make more of function or feature X, for example. One of the most important things I learned, which I spoke about before, that business about how using different channels, you can, it was a BT experiment where we tested phone only, post only response and phone or post. And we found that the response rate for phone or post, when you offer people a choice, was more or less the sum total of the response rate for phone only plus the response rate for post only. So about 6% of people replied when you could only reply by post, 2% of people replied when you could only reply by phone, and nearly, not quite, 8% of people, and these were sample sizes of 50,000, by the way, so it's definitely statistically has some robustness to it, okay? That was nearly 8% when you offered people both modes of responding. Now, at its very banal level, if you're simply using direct marketing to earn, all you'll do when you look at that is you'll say, that means that we should always offer people two forms of response when we sell to them by post, okay? Which, by the way, may not even be true for absolutely everything you sell. There may be more complicated things you want to sell where you need a phone call, for example. But even so, it might be an argument for saying, actually, let them request a phone call by post, because people basically have very strong preferences however they interact. Some people are telephobic and they hate making phone calls. Some people will assume that they'll have to wait for 10 minutes for their call to be answered. All sorts of reasons might encourage you. But the vital thing which that shows, which is a much more generalizable finding and therefore much more interesting, is that when you sell the same thing through different channels, the degree of cannibalization is generally less than people expect. There's always a school of thought which says if we offer X, if we have a drive-through window at our fast food restaurant, all that will happen is people will go to the drive-through window who would have stopped and gone to the restaurant anyway. So we have all the cost of operating drive-through, and all we're doing effectively is serving the same people in a different way. And that's a very common assumption you'll hear. You might hear it called revenue abstraction. You might hear it called cannibalization. You might hear it called revenue dilution. But the simple fact remains that actually that fact is not totally erroneous, okay? It's not totally fatuous as a belief. I'm not suggesting that if you offer a McDonald's drive-through, nobody has ever used the McDonald's drive-through who would have been prepared to have stopped in the restaurant had the drive-through not existed. I'm simply saying that a surprisingly large portion of any incremental channel you offer will be incremental, okay? And mainstream economics tends to assume people know what they want in advance. They then decide how much they're willing to pay for it. They then decide in which channel they wish to procure it. That's the mainstream economic model of human behavior. The reality is that this is the Austrian economic school model of economic behavior, which says that we buy things or we interact or we act to remove some sense of unease. And that unease is heavily contextually affected. I'm hungry, okay? But you might be hungry when you're at home and you want to spend the evening watching Netflix, or you might be hungry when you're driving in a car and you need to stop to have a pee anyway. Or you might be hungry and you have two kids asleep in the back of the car. So the last thing you want to do is to go out and get into a restaurant because you can't leave them in the car asleep, but you don't want them to wake them up. But bingo, there's a drive-through. Okay, so you're not just serving a set, stable person with a need. You're selling to a contextual job to be done, a contextual problem. And the more modes of sale that you offer, I think, by the way, I don't think e-commerce will ever reach a maximal efficient level of scale until there's a nationwide open access locker system for delivery. Because I think I think very interestingly, I think one of the ceilings to e-commerce is there's a limit to what any individual human being can buy online because it just becomes cognitively too complicated. If you find in the run up to Christmas, you've ordered 5 things, various presents for friends, relatives, etc., particularly if you're not getting those things delivered straight to them, that you're getting them delivered to your house. First of all, your drive turns into a UPS or a FedEx or a DPD logistics hub. Secondly, you spend about 10 minutes a day checking what has arrived and what hasn't arrived, because it's just too mentally complicated for you to get your head around. And so understanding that you're selling you don't really just have a target audience. Don't get preoccupied with demographics. You have a target moment. You have a target mindset. You have a target context. And the same product can reach different people in a different mindset. I don't know why it is, but some people like going to fast food restaurants and ordering face-to-face. Some people like using the screens. Sometimes the same people will sometimes use a screen, and they'll sometimes use the counter, and sometimes they'll use the drive-through. And so this idea that you have a target audience is in many ways, a mistake in itself. Don't necessarily extrapolate demographic information, on your customers from who happens to buy your product through one particular digital channel. Because the digital channel might not be uncovering the demographic that finds your product appealing. It might be uncovering the moment or the mindset where that particular product is most appealing. So I think that's a really important thing, which is that, if you are simply optimizing short-term transactional sales, it's simply erroneous to assume that you are learning much. And in the case of Facebook advertising, once they turned on iOS 14, what you were doing was you were fragilizing your entire business, because a large part of your business's revenue was dependent on a source of customers that you did not, and a source of information that you did not control. Previously, when you did direct marketing, you got a response rate, you got an ROI, but you also got a return in information, an RII. You learned something more about who your customers were or who potentially they might be. Suddenly, by purely optimizing short-term transactional effects, you make a terrible mistake. But here's the problem, Digital marketers have to some extent fallen into that same trap that many of those clients, many of those sort of senior people have, who work in engineering-driven functions, who work in anything mathematical, anything engineering or tech-focused, tends to have this reductionist mindset, which is you only do what you can prove in advance. The reason you have a creative function in marketing and you need creative people is because you will never find a significant breakthrough. No, that's probably unfair. You will very rarely find that you stumble on a major breakthrough by only doing things for which there is prior existing evidence. And the reason is, as I often put it, if there were a logical answer to those problems, someone would have found it already. The uncharted waters, the untapped markets, the unknown needs generally tend to be discovered if you do something a little bit counterintuitive, a little bit strange. So one way of talking to senior people within your organization as a marketer, there are 2 things you could do. You can talk about psychology, particularly using behavioral economics language, because it's a language they recognize and understand. When you talk to them in behavioral economics ergot, they see it as building on an existing body of knowledge they have, rather than refuting an existing body of knowledge they have. And so by selling something as an augmentation of economics rather than a refutation of economics, it's much more likely that people who've bought into the economic mindset will accept what you have to say. So that's one reason why behavioral economics, much to Daniel Kahneman's annoyance, it annoyed Daniel Kahneman greatly that he said, I had to call what I was doing, which is psychology, I had to pretend it was economics before government would take it seriously. And he's right to complain about that to some extent. But for whatever reason, the United States White House finds it acceptable to have a council of economic advisors, but it doesn't find it acceptable to have a council of psychological advisors. So the best way to get in there and influence things is to inject some behavioral economists into the Council of Economic Advisors, rather than trying to say we should close down the Council of Economic Advisors and replace them with psychologists, which is an argument which you might win, but it might take you a lifetime or more. And therefore, it's simply too slow an argument to win. So that's one way of solving it. The other way of solving it, I think, is to talk probabilistically. And I don't think we do this nearly enough, because most marketing represents, to some extent, a kind of bet. And roughly speaking, there are two kinds of bets. There are bets which are a bit like betting odd or even in roulette, or betting on red or black on roulette. And those are bets which have a high chance of winning, but a relatively low payoff. Okay? And there are other bets which are different. That's like betting on an individual number, for example, betting on 17 at roulette. A low chance of success, but when you do succeed, the payoff is very high. But here's the point that Jeff Bezos makes about swinging for the fences, okay? Jeff Bezos says, okay, there are two things you can do in baseball. You can either hit, swing for a home run, swinging for the fences, as they call it, in which case your maximum payoff, if the bases are loaded, is 4. Or you can play conservatively and aim to make one base at a time, or maybe one run at a time, but you can aim for more modest, recurring incremental gains. Now, obviously, how close you are to the end of the innings will determine the relative ratio of whether you do one or whether you do the other. There's no point, if you're 2 strikes down at the bottom of an innings, there's no point in actually, playing for incremental gains at that point. Okay? The top of an innings, maybe you argue that actually getting some people on base is a more important thing to do in advance. So the odds vary according to what you're doing, the individual circumstances of the situation. And so the second thing I don't think marketers do enough is to talk probabilistically. Now, Jeff Bezos makes the point that he said in baseball, if you hit a home run, the most you can actually score is 4. That's apparently when you make a home run, and of course you bat in the other 3 people who are occupying first base, second base, and third base. Okay, that's a 4. As Bezos points out, he says business, unlike baseball, has effectively no particular curtailment on the reward distribution. In baseball, the most you can score is a 4. In business, you can potentially score 1,000. But you tend to score 1,000 in business, not by copying other people, not by doing a kind of knockoff of someone else's thing. It tends to be something which is slightly eccentric or weird. It tends to be something that's counterintuitive. It tends to be something that people haven't tried before. It tends to be something, it doesn't necessarily have to be a huge bet, but you have to spend some of your money on those things where the cost of the bet is relatively manageable, but the potential payoff is, if not limitless, it's, many, many multipliers of something else. And so I think there's something there which is, I think there's something there which is really important, that we don't have that conversation. We tend to go, advertising, it's great, it'll work. And by the way, at the very general level, and I think Jeremy Bullmore would agree with this, most of the time advertising works. There are very, very few cases of companies that have gone bust because they've spent too much money on advertising. It did happen occasionally in the dot-com era, when the business itself had no basis for existing. But generally speaking, okay, the only time you shouldn't advertise is when you're a bad product. If you're a bad product, advertising will kill you off faster, because it'll accelerate the level of disappointment, it'll accelerate the negative word of mouth, and it'll accelerate the rate in which people discover that your product is bad and tell other people about it. So if you have a bad product, do not advertise it. If you have a good product, generally advertising will always work. And if you have a very good product, advertising will work disproportionately well by accelerating not only the number of people who buy it because they've seen an advertisement, but it will also accelerate the rate in which the product and the use of the product and the normalization of the product permeate through the market, social networks, and everything else. Most people in Britain bought a microwave because they saw somebody else's microwave. But if you can get more microwaves out there fast, that effect might take 3 years to spread through a population, or 5 rather than 15. Very, very difficult, by the way, to track the sales of. I advertised a microwave. Somebody bought a microwave. 5 of their friends saw the microwave and thought it was great and went and bought out a microwave. It's very difficult to attribute those 6 sales, all but one of them, or even the first sale, to the advertisement you did. Does that mean you shouldn't advertise? It's a bit like the cloth masks conundrum, which beset everybody at the beginning of COVID. Just because you don't have perfect evidence that cloth masks work, okay, doesn't mean that you shouldn't be able to recommend that on the balance of probabilities, it would make sense for people to wear cloth masks in a crowded space if they can't get access to a better form of mask. A cloth mask will still help. There was a reason, by the way, you didn't want the public wearing full, N95 or PPE, because you wanted to reserve those for medical staff who are definitely going to come into contact with the COVID virus. Okay, so there's a good reason why you didn't say, hey, everybody wear, a top of the range medical mask, because the last thing you wanted is, effectively the public getting access to those in advance of members of the nursing or medical profession. But cloth masks were potentially infinitely available. You could even make one at home yourself if you wanted from, spare fine material. They could be mass produced. There was no role for them in hospitals, so you weren't actually depriving a hospital of something necessary. But nonetheless, this perfect scientific mentality goes, we can't say anything until we know for sure. In those interesting forms of marketing where the return is disproportionately high, by definition, you probably won't know in advance whether it will work. The question is, can you measure it at a safe scale so that you can afford for it not to work, but you can profit majorly from the huge gains in the event that it does work, or better still, work spectacularly, which sometimes happens, by the way. And that's another thing, which is one of the weird things I've never fully understood about doing behavioral science. And some of you might be able to help me out with an answer. Is we occasionally go into an organization and we do something that is, disproportionately valuable at an incredibly low cost. For one airline, we found that it made them several £million a year if you changed the button to say, find my flights rather than find flights. For another business, we changed their call center script. That cost about £20,000 to £30,000. The effect it had on the retention of their customers, was worth several £million a year in incremental profit. Again, huge ROIs. Now, this is one thing you've also got to look out for. People in finance, if you ever go in as a marketer and say you've got an ROI of 30 to 1, they think you're bullshitting. Because they're not used to ROIs of that scale, because they're purely operating in the level of rationality. I had one client who literally said he shifted advertising from one thing to another and went to the board and said to the finance director, the ROI of this new activity is 14 to 1. And the chap said, that can't be right. ROIs are like 1.3 to 1 or 1.2 to 1. You don't get ROIs of 14 to 1. Now, the point is, in marketing, what you lose in certainty, you gain in multipliers. Okay, so the vital point we've got to get through to people in business is this probabilistic point. It's talking about probabilities. That yes, this is not an exact science. Where it's different from an exact science, and go and find that Jeff Bezos quote. I'll share it on the platform after the talk. Go and find that Jeff Bezos quote and say, marketing is to some extent the place where you bet on 17 occasionally. Yes, we can't guarantee it'll work. We don't have the evidence to show that it'll work, but we are betting a finite result. The value we get here is not immediate short-term success. It's the small chance of a massive breakthrough. And I think that's one really important thing we have to do if we're to make marketing look like a science. Because the biggest problem most of you guys have, and it occurs time and time again in the chat function, is how do I talk to very left-brain people about what I'm doing? And I think if we're to be truly scientific, we have to start talking the language of probability. look, we're spending $20,000 to change find flights to find my flights. To be honest, okay, 2 times out of 3, maybe doing something like that has no effect. Okay, that's not the point. It doesn't cost very much to do. 1 time in 3, it actually makes you literally an ROI of, potentially over 5 years, you might have an ROI of, 100 to 1. Okay. And as Jeff Bezos also says, those breakthroughs pay for a hell of a lot of experiments. The second thing to do, which nobody does, is to share things that don't work. Tell those people not only about the things you've done that are successful, but tell them about the things you've done that haven't worked. Because there's a famous Edison quote where he said, "We haven't failed. We've discovered 100 ways not to make a light bulb." And I think the other thing to do is to be completely candid and transparent with the rest of the organization and admit the fact that we're going to do this thing and we're going to try it to see what happens. The third thing is, which is a question worth asking, and it's not always easy to answer. The most difficult, I think, aspect of business decision making is actually timing. Okay. And, I don't think, it's really interesting, certain things, certain ideas just have a moment when they might take off. And the question you've got to ask is, do you have to wait? If you have a loss-making product, do you continue to invest in it in the hope that it will go big? Or do you basically say, one of the virtues of what we're doing by experimenting is we kill our failures really fast? I genuinely would argue that is one of the areas where you are almost condemned to being subjective. In the famous case of Nespresso, they weren't doing very well in their early years, and they survived by lying to Nestle about their sales figures. They basically misrepresented their sales figures to Nestle to prevent themselves being closed down. Not, I think, because they wanted to keep their jobs. I think they genuinely believed, look, this is a much bigger idea. Now, there's one question you can look at here, which I think might be important. Not always easy, okay? Don't necessarily just ask how quickly is this product growing. Ask how many people who buy this product buy it again. Because there, I think, if you have a lot of people trying your product once, okay, and they don't come back, kill the product, okay? If you have the same people, albeit small in number, buying your product repeatedly. Now, I don't know how many of you are Brits on the call. Snowdonia Welsh cheddar or Black Bomber. That cheddar in a wax container, it's round, okay? It started off as a completely niche cheddar in kind of small cheese shops. What you could notice about it was that the people who bought it again, okay? What you now see is that it's almost universally available at multiple retailers. And this is my bit of advice I give to all investors. I say there's one bit of data which gets lost when you aggregate financial data in aggregate sales figures. And the worst offender in aggregating data about customers is the board meeting. Because what does the board meeting do? It has one line that says, that's what a balance sheet does. It has revenue at the top, and it just says revenue. And then there are 5 lines detailing costs. And as Jules Goddard at the London Business School says, the ratio tends to proceed in that order, where there's 5 times as much conversation about costs as there is about revenue. But you have that one line, revenue. Maybe if you're subtle, you might get a few extra lines. But when you aggregate it, that's what all financial companies are being told. What's the revenue? But the revenue isn't telling you the thing that might be most important, which is even if your revenue is crap, if everybody who buys for you sticks, right? Air fryers, mattress toppers, Japanese toilets. I always quote these products. I say, the interesting thing about these products is they will be huge one day. Now, I can't say whether that's going to be 22.25 or whether it's going to be 22.50. But the simple thing about these products is not that they're very popular, that they have huge market penetration. There's something really important about them, which is everybody who buys them basically becomes a convert. They can't envisage their life without them. And so that vital thing seems to crop up, which is, are you getting the data you really want? Because the real data that matters is not your conversion data, it's your repeat sales data. Are you investing where you should? Okay. And here's the final product I'm going to leave you with. Making a sale to someone is like crack. It's a really quick hit of information which justifies your marketing investment. Okay. It's a quick hit drug. Customer retention is almost impossible to measure except over a 5-year timescale. Maybe it's a 3-year timescale. Okay. Win back, yes, if you have a win back center, you can measure it a bit better. But the value, it's an opportunity cost. It's not a win. And so the value is less quantifiable. And in almost every case I've seen, too little money gets spent. Too little money gets spent on B2B marketing in the digital space. Why? Because B2B marketing isn't generally a click with a credit card kind of marketing. It's a long, slow burn. And so the incremental effect of various activities becomes slower to measure, and it becomes, because it's slower, it becomes impossible to disentangle from other factors, because every additional month you have to use to make a link between an input and an output, or what you might call a stimulus and a response, is a month in which lots of other things happen, which could be attributable to the effect. You know, we did this thing, 5 months later we sold more that. Well, it could be because we did this thing, or it could be because in the intervening 5 months, one of our competitors put the prices up. You know, disentangling those two things is very difficult. So I worry about this. As I said, I worked in direct marketing. I'm sorry, we really should have warned you. It's great being able to measure. The downside is you're never allowed to do anything which you can't measure. And a very large part of marketing, the long and the short of it, as Ben Ettenfield called it, will inevitably and unavoidably be immeasurable always. And we need to learn to live with that. So I hope that's been useful. I look forward to catching up later in the week for questions. But one thing I will say is test silly things. Don't just test the things that make sense. Everybody else is testing the things that make sense. Okay. Nobody's testing the silly things. The silly things are more likely to fail, but when they succeed, the silly things actually pay dividends far, far more. One person online found that the more variables somebody tested, disproportionately, the more they valued from testing. And they realized that the reason was, which is that when you tested 8 variables, you tended to test things which seemed a bit irrelevant, or which you'd never bothered to test before, or which seemed a bit gratuitous. And weirdly, it was tweaking with those things that seemed to provide the real payback. Thank you very much indeed, and see you for Q&A. And in the meantime, I'm on the platform, and if anybody has any questions, just ask them on the platform. You can't beat that. But I'm also really keen to see you. I think it's on Thursday. I hope I've got that right. All the best.